Okay, this discussion is based on or relates to chapter 11 in Schiller, Aggregate Supply, Aggregate Demand. In earlier chapters, we talked about business cycles, and the model we used to kind of discuss it was based on this two-good economy: consumer goods, investment goods. And we had this production possibility frontier. The idea is that if you were on or very close to this production possibility frontier, then the economy was at full employment. And for us, historically, full employment corresponded to about 4.5 to 5% unemployment rate. Meaning that if the economy had about 4.5, 5% unemployment, we assume that we are on or very close to the production possibility frontier. Anything more than that we would be somewhere inside, which means we are suffering from unemployment, 8, 9, 10%, and therefore the idea is to somehow, this means recession or even close to depression if it goes to 15% unemployment and so forth. And the idea is to push the economy toward the full employment. And the fluctuation between going toward and away from the production possible frontier is what we thought, we argued was this business cycle. Here is real GDP, which captures the level of economic activities. So this fluctuation toward and away from the production possible frontier gave rise to this business cycles, which was fluctuations along the average trend. This was a trend, meaning that long-term average growth. And then you had times that the economy was above the trend, meaning that we're sort of experiencing expansion, or we were below the trend, which means the economy is experiencing contraction. And the debate is, how do you manage the economy from overheating, meaning that it goes into too much expansion, or too much contraction, which means that deep recession, or even if it becomes prolonged, it will be called deep depression. So how do we essentially smooth out the fluctuations in the economy? We can never get rid of it, but the idea was to smooth it out. And so the discussion of aggregate supply, aggregate demand is an attempt to address this issue. There are all sorts of political and historical debates on this. Essentially, the debate is between two groups of sort of economic thinkers, those who are what we call supply-siders, notably the classical economists, and then demand-siders, usually referred to as Keynesians. And we will explore these ideas, but let's understand first what aggregate demand curve represents. So we have the real output, real GDP, and then here we have price level, not price of a good, but average prices of goods and services that are available in the economy. And the aggregate demand is downward sloping. Aggregate demand is essentially a sum of different components of demand for goods and services in the economy. It comes from consumers, comes from investors, come from government, and finally come from foreign demand, which is referring basically export minus import, or we call it net export, if we happen to have an economy that has a net export economy. And the idea is, the next question is, why aggregate demand slope is downward? And logic for this is different from when we considered demand for a given good, price and quantity, where we said that at higher prices people buy lower than if prices went down. So let's understand the logic for downward sloping reasons for aggregate demand to be downward sloping. One is called real balance effect. Essentially, when falling price level, meaning goods and services from appliances to food to fuel and energy and so forth, if they're falling, this essentially means that your wages have a bigger purchasing power. So increase in real purchasing power of income. And also, if you have savings, your savings are worth more because they can purchase more. So essentially, falling prices translate into higher real purchasing power of income and wealth of the consumers. And as a result, consumers will demand more goods and services. So falling price level translates into higher purchasing power of wages and your savings in the form of that makes up your wealth, and therefore the consumer demand will increase and creates more output, and behind the output is employment, which pushes us toward production possible frontier. Another reason is foreign trade effect. And the idea here is that you compare price level in US versus price level elsewhere, like let's say Europe. If price level in the US is falling relative to prices in Europe, then two things will happen. One is that American citizens will buy more domestically produced goods as opposed to imports. And then also foreigners will find that the prices in the US attractive, so they come to the US to buy appliances, cars, food, whatever. And that again translates into higher demand and therefore higher output and unemployment that follows it. And finally, interest rate effect. Again, falling price level will translate into lower demand for money. Because if prices are falling, you don't need to carry as much cash. If you need to borrow, you don't need to borrow as much because television sets are less expensive and cars are less expensive and so forth. Lower demand for money translates into lower interest rate, and lower interest rate will increase demand for loans, for one thing. Also, will if banks are not paying you big interest rate, you go ahead and take the money out and spend it, and so as a result, you generate more demand, and therefore more output and employment will follow. These are the reasons why the aggregate demand is downward sloping. Now let's quickly look at aggregate supply. Again, real GDP and price level. An aggregate supply is upward sloping. There are essentially two reasons. One is profit margin. As prices rise, given that the costs don't rise quickly, then the profit margin will improve, and that causes the producers to bring more goods and services to the market, and that means that more output will be produced, and behind it more employment and so forth. The second reason is costs. The reason that that as we try to expand production, that will lead to higher costs as employers have to compete for energy, labor, and so forth. So therefore, the price level has to rise to compensate them for higher level of costs. So therefore, another reason that aggregate supply is upward sloping, meaning that as we try to expand production, the cost will rise, and therefore prices must sooner or later rise to keep up. Because, for example, if you're trying to hire workers, then you have higher wages that eventually you have to start offering, and higher wages eventually have to find their way into higher prices of finished goods that the consumers receive. So these are two reasons that aggregate supply is upward sloping. So now that we have understood in principle what these two represent, aggregate demand and aggregate supply, let's put them together. Again, real GDP and price level, and then you have aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And intersection of the two will give you equilibrium price level and equilibrium output. And so far, so good. The only question is this equilibrium level of output ideal? Because the economy may settle somewhere here with 10% unemployment, and the economy is not moving because aggregate supply and aggregate demand have basically settled in an equilibrium situation. We really need to be here, and that's where more output is produced and more people are hired, and this is really associated with the full employment, and yet the economy has settled somewhere to the left of it. And so for that reason, we have undesirable outcome even though the economy is in equilibrium. So now to essentially get to this level of output, we could perhaps shift aggregate demand to the right, meaning either consumers spend more or investors spend more on plant and equipment and so forth. If these two are not willing to participate for a host of reasons, then it would be mostly left to the governments to make up the difference by boosting demand for goods and services in order to generate demand for the economy, pushing us toward the full employment, or ideally in some cases would be also to have more exports. Now you may have a situation where you don't have much to export, so this is out. And if consumers are nervous for a host of reasons, they're not sure if they will have a job next month or next year, so they're not willing to spend. If they're not willing to spend, investors are not willing to upgrade their plant and equipment and create more productive capacity, and therefore the economy contracts. And in fact, if that happens, the economy can contract even more to the left, and that creates more unemployment and so forth and so on. And so that's one approach. The other approach would be to create more output and employment through boosting the aggregate supply. Somehow remove regulations, for example, find cheaper source of energy, new technologies, and so forth. Except aggregate supply is a very slow process. It sometimes may take a decade or two before we find a new source of energy or the new innovations in technology and so forth and so on. So, or more educated labor force. All of these things cannot happen overnight. And so therefore manipulation of aggregate supply is more difficult, and it's only a long run approach, while when the economy is contracting, most often we kind of look toward managing the aggregate demand side, although this is very much debated among politicians and economists based on their own philosophical point of view. And so in order to manage the economy, sometimes you have to basically do both, meaning you have aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and you may have to somehow boost aggregate demand through government spending or some stimulative tax incentives for consumers to spend or tax incentives for firms to upgrade their plant and equipment, whatever. And then at the same time, maybe some reduction in regulations or discovery of quick access to cheaper source of energy, etc., to somehow manage the economy from both directions, from aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And so now let's talk about some of the theories that that kind of help us to understand what's the best approach if the economy should be somehow in equilibrium and that equilibrium is below the full potential, let's say, the equilibrium output. And so one is the Keynesian theory, which essentially is, as I said earlier, is a demand sider, which essentially says, look, when the economy is contracting, at least in the short run, the problem is that we don't have enough consumer spending or investment spending or not enough exports. And if none of these things work, if they're not sufficient, then we have to throw in there the government in order to boost the economy and bring the unemployment down. And that's one approach. The other approach, which is also part of the demand side, is monetary theory. And this assumption here is that we need to bring the interest rate down. If we bring the interest rate down, then consumers can borrow and buy the car and the refrigerator because it's cheaper to borrow. Investors will also find borrowing cheaper, and therefore the aggregate demand will shift to the right as a result. So in order to do so, the central bank in the US would be the Fed, will ease the money supply. And so to think of it, here is the quantity of money, and here is the price of money, interest rate, and there is the demand for money, and there's a supply of money at each point in time, money supply. So by expanding money supply, then interest rate will fall. And that in turn will boost the aggregate demand through lowering the cost of borrowing on the part of consumers and investors. And in fact, governments that issue bonds, they may also find the borrowing cost to be lower, and therefore you may see boost in government spending as a result. The supply siders, on the other hand, they basically think that the economy should be stimulated through shift in the right direction of the aggregate supply, and that can happen as a result of lower taxes, which will encourage firms and to take more risk and invest more, or the labor will basically work longer hours if the government took less out of the paycheck, etc., etc. So that's essentially the approach that the supply siders argue. And then is finally an eclectic sort of explanation or set of ideas, and that is that you do a mix of all these in order to achieve that, meaning that sometimes you approach it through government spending, or you have reduction in taxes on investment in plant and equipment, etc., in order to boost not only the aggregate demand, but also build more infrastructure and more foundation for the productive capacity of the economy, and therefore shift the aggregate supply to the right. So essentially, we talk about fiscal policy approach or monetary policy approach, and then the supply side is essentially focuses on taxes and opportunities for discoveries of source and so forth. Now, This, in essence, completes the discussion for aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Now let's look at some of the questions that I have asked you to examine. The question or the problem is number one. That's on page 248. It says illustrate these events with aggregate supply and aggregate demand shifts. The first one is that you have, again, aggregate supply and aggregate demand, real GDP, price level. And the first one, government increases defense spending. That means new government spending and therefore shift to the right of aggregate demand. And the idea is that eventually creates more output and maybe behind it employment. Then also ask for headline story in page 241. The headline story there is the hurricane damage to Gulf ports delayed deliveries and raises costs. So here, if you think of it again in terms of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, hurricane will impact the ability to produce, ability to deliver energy, and roads are damaged, and telecommunication. That impacts adversely the ability to produce, and therefore aggregate supply shifts to the left. And so that's the impact of, let's say, supply shocks, if you will. Oil, the next one is imported oil gets cheaper. Cheaper oil means lower cost of production, and lower cost of production shifts aggregate supply to the right. With the same aggregate demand, you have more real output. And finally, Congress approves a one-time tax rebate. This is one-time giving citizens tax rebate, which means to give them, shove money in their pocket and say, go out there and spend. And therefore, that's an aggregate demand sort of approach to the economy. Number two, based on the headline on 241, illustrate the aggregate supply shifts that occur. I think we've talked about that earlier, that hurricane destroys the telecommunication roads and ports and their natural gas and oil pipelines and so forth. All of those will cut off or choke off the resources needed to produce goods and services. Aggregate supply shifts to the left. Identify the old equilibrium and a new equilibrium macro. So this would be the old and this would be the new. Okay. So supply shocks causes output and employment to fall and causes prices to rise. What macro ailment results? Well, macro ailment will be higher unemployment, lower output, and higher prices because there are less goods and services available, and the prices will begin to rise. And finally, part D, how can the economy stay healthy in this case? Well, the question is, we have to quickly rebuild the infrastructure, to open up the ports, reconnect the telecommunication, reconnect the gas and oil pipelines and so forth in order to bring the aggregate supply back. Because at this point, boosting the economy through aggregate demand is not going to help, because it only feeds the inflation. So if aggregate supply has shifted to the left, and therefore prices have gone up, output has fallen, if you try to boost the economy by pumping money in or shoving money in the pockets of citizens, then it basically causes not necessarily more output, because there's really resources that are out there to produce more output. It just only feeds inflation. So therefore, it's best to reconnect the supply side of the economy as opposed to trying to boost the economy through the demand side. And finally, graph the following aggregate supply and aggregate demand curves. Be sure to draw the scale. So you have essentially a table with numbers, and then through that you can find where the equilibrium occurs. Part A, what is the equilibrium output? You can, if you have a price level and you have for every price level, let's say for when the price level is 100, aggregate supply will be 4, and when it's 110, it would be then 10, and then when aggregate price level is 140, then it would be 14, and then when it's 200, and then only little increase in output, because the economy cannot just indefinitely grow for just because prices are higher. And then on the demand side, you can, again, when the price level is 16, somewhere there, I'm sorry, when the price level is 100, the aggregate demand is 16, somewhere here, and then you can just place this number and you have the aggregate demand, and then through there you could find equilibrium and so forth. If the quantity of output demand at every price level increases by 2 trillion, what happens to the equilibrium output prices? Graph your answer. This is something I will leave it for you to do. Use the numbers, maybe use a grid paper so you could accurately come up with final answers.